Welcome to the Cyber X Factor, the podcast where we deep dive into the cutting edge of cyber governance and cyber risk management. I'm your host, Kevin Richards, president of X Analytics. Today, I'm thrilled to have two remarkable guests who are no strangers to the challenges and opportunities facing today's boardroom. Joining me today are Karen Higgins-Carter, a board member and technology executive known for driving technology innovation and digital transformation, and Bob West, a seasoned cybersecurity leader, a former CISO and strategic advisor with decades of experience guiding organizations through the evolving cyber threat landscape. The three of us recently teamed up on a webinar with the NACD, specifically talking about cyber risk oversight. And the feedback from that session was overwhelming. So we decided to just continue the conversation. Still, one of the biggest questions I continue to get from that discussion, from the attendees, the leaders, and the board members, is really what belongs in a board meeting when it comes to talking about cyber risk. It's a challenge that many CISOs face. How do you answer tough questions about ransomware or data breaches without diving too deep into the technical weeds? We'll explore that and see how we can strike the right balance and ensure that the message resonates with the board rather than overwhelming them with techno speak. We'll also continue a discussion on financial data-driven presentations of cyber risk with a little bit of a twist. So we started the conversation showing here's some ideas, and we're going to go into that a little bit more today. But I've had people say things like, I'm warming up to this. I'm buying into the vision of talking about cyber risk in a financial context. But how do I trust those numbers? We started discussing this on the webinar, but I think we're going to dig deeper here with Karen and Bob to come up with some insights and some thoughts around that. So grab your coffee, get comfortable, and let's unpack some complexities around cyber governance and cyber risk management on the X Factor. All right, Karen, Bob, thank you for joining us today. It was really great. A few weeks ago, we had that NACD webinar. We talked about a lot of really interesting things. And so really the hope for today is let's just continue that conversation. We had some really good starts, but we'll be able to take it and run from here. But before we jump straight into the fun content, for the people who are looking at the podcast that weren't part of our NACD webinar, thought maybe you could go and do some really quick introductions. And Karen, we'll start with you. A little quick introduction about yourself.
Sure. Karen Higgins-Carter, former technology and digital officer at Gilbane. I also serve as a board director on International Money Express, as well as Otsuka Pharmaceuticals for the U.S. subsidiaries.
All right, fantastic. And Bob, real quick introduction for you.
Yeah, so I've worked in cybersecurity for a little over 30 years. I've had enterprise roles, I've done consulting, and have had product roles as well. And I serve on a number of advisory boards, and I'm on the board of directors of the USA Track and Field Foundation.
Very cool. By the way, I did get some behind the scenes webinar statistics from that discussion, and I'm just going to look at them here real quick. First, we were within the top 5 of most attended NACD events over the last year and a half. So that was pretty cool. Yeah, there you go. We scored a 4.62 out of 5 for satisfaction, which that means like 1 or 2 people gave us a 4, which kind of stank, but whatever.
Oh, they were poor judges of character. I mean, come on.
Yeah, and then you've got a bunch of people that will just never give 5s. So we'll just give them that. But notably, no one left early. So one of the things that they see is if it's a topic that people aren't interested in, the count starts dropping. And our count stood spot on for the entire event. So people were engaged. So I think from there, we can call this a huge success. So great job.
Awesome.
One of the things that I was more interested in at a macro, because I started looking at the polling, and I found that to be really interesting. And just as a slight tangent, a couple days ago, it was last week, I did a conversation with about 40 CISOs for one of our ISACs. And it was essentially the same conversation that we had with the directors I had with 40 CISOs. I asked, a lot of the same questions. The polling questions were absolutely identical. But the conversation was, instead of from the director level down, it was CISO, how they view themselves at presenting to the board. And so when I think about the polling questions, I put them side by side. And the first one, which was, how much time do we spend talking about cyber governance and cyber risk to the full board? And now, being CISOs, and Bob, you're going to chuckle on this, there was a huge debate of why full board versus, say, risk committee or audit committee. I was like, all right, fine, I get it. But it was full board. And when I looked at this, if I looked at the percentage of respondents that had 15 minutes or less, and so that was two of the categories. It was up to 15 minutes or none unless there was a problem. If you put those two together, it was 84% of the board members say that they spent less than 15 minutes allocated unless there's a problem, and 89% of the CISOs say they spent less than 15 minutes per quarter talking cyber to their board, which is baffling to me, because if we think about this, if cyber is the top thing on board agendas, board priorities, and are we misaligned? So let's just start. So Karen, think about it. It seems like a duality here. Are we misaligned on priorities versus attention?
I would say, from my perspective, we're probably in a place where the time allocated to the topic is based upon the track record of the presenter and whether it's a quality discussion or not, right? If your CISO doesn't have a good track record of presenting a relevant discussion about cybersecurity risk as a systemic risk to the business, then you're not going to have much time allocated in future topics. I think if it's a more technical discussion, it will tend to stay within committee versus full board. And that's a broad generalization,
Sure,
but
sure,
that's
sure, sure.
always my, when I read the board agenda, I know what to expect by and large in each section based
And
upon my experience with the presenter
yeah,
previously.
that makes perfect sense. And Bob, I know you're doing a lot of advisory for CISOs getting ready for their board meetings. So
Mhm.
how do we address that piece of, if you got a bad track record of throwing techno jargon or whatever that's causing that attention, what would you advise people? And we're going to talk a little bit what goes into the board meeting, but at a high level, what would your thoughts be on this?
Well, I think the first piece of advice is that there are a large number of CISOs that I work with that are very, very, very smart, but don't understand how to translate into business terms and make the assumption that everyone is as technical as they are. When I present to boards, I have 2 or 3 slides max, and one of the keys that engages the board is doing something crazy and speaking to them in terms they understand. We've been having this conversation about how number one, cyber risk is one of the biggest existential threats for businesses. And I could definitely understand why a board would not want to spend a time with a CISO if they're not communicating in language they understand and being able to couch things in a business context, right? So speak business, speak number one, get to the point, and make sure that the message communicates really clearly what the state of affairs is and what's the help that you need from the board of directors.
So that's an interesting piece there. What's the help that you need from the board? I think this is an area that most CISOs miss. There's so focused on telling whatever that story is. I've got my precious few minutes. I have to tell them
Yeah.
something, that they forget that they've got a group, depending how big, 8, 10, 12, however many business professionals that have probably been through battles that they've never even dreamed of, that have some insights and guidance that they could bring to the table. But I see that this is still an area where we trip because, again, we've got that 15 minutes or less, that precious seconds. And in the webinar, I put up that little pyramid. Karen, you called it the Kevin's hierarchy. I wish maybe I'll have to trademark it or something. Where we've got the basics, the cyber capabilities, and there's a discussion on compliance, and then on risk, and then on governance. And I'm from our conversation with the NACD webinar, which was only 3 weeks ago. I've probably had easily a dozen emails from people going, I'm struggling here. And more from the technical people, I have consternation of what I should be talking about. So what do we talk about? So we've got these things. I've got 15 minutes or less, and there's probably someone with a clock watch timer that's watching it. So Karen, think about this. If I have the Bob 3 slides, what do those 3 slides look like?
Off the top of my head, let me think. I can't read Bob's mind, but remembering our triangle.
Unacceptable. Unacceptable.
You
You're
used to say
so
you were
talking
clairvoyant.
hours.
I'm sorry. I
You're,
think I
yeah,
had that in my
yeah,
notes.
yeah. Isn't that part of the basic job description?
Well, I think sometimes if you put yourself in the CISO's shoes, that's what they feel like. They feel like they have to read the mind of the board. And it is a tough topic, right? It's not like you're presenting financial statements that have been standard, for many, many years, given that cyber is a new-ish discipline, if you will, compared to other topics that are typically discussed. It's not necessarily regulatory either. In some businesses like banking or healthcare or others that have a large privacy component, you can kind of rely on a regulatory framework. But I think what is at the top of that triangle is looking at it through a business risk lens. And what I always like in board discussions is getting feedback on what does this risk look like relative to other risks in the business. So getting feedback on, am I taking this too seriously? Am I, pushing for too much investment in cyber when there's other risks that need to be mitigated, particularly in this day and age between supply chain, geopolitical risk, safety, other types of risks in the business. So I think that's generally, if I had to think about the first page, that's really it, which is sizing the risk in light of the overall environment. And then the art is, what do we want to invest to be able to steer the business fast and controlled in the direction that makes sense for the shareholders. So that's a Mario Andretti statement, right? In terms of what are brakes for in a car, they are not to decelerate. They are so you can continue to drive fast and controlled. And so I think that's should be the overarching theme of the discussion, but it's a challenge because your typical frameworks like NIST and CIS 18, et cetera, don't lend themselves to that discussion very easily.
Sure. Bob, did she get all 3, or she gave you the front page? What were your other 2 slides?
I'll tell you. So, front page is state of affairs, right? Red, yellow, green. So, in the spirit of Mario Andretti, got to have some stoplights, right? And then the next page is, so here's what we're working on. Here's the issues that we have, and the final page is, so here's what we need from the board. I think you raised a good point, Karen, in terms of CISOs tend to be myopic in the context of they're looking at cyber risk all day long, and that is their world. And to your point, you have to frame things in a broad risk context. So you were mentioning geopolitical risk as being one of the components. There's also correlation with geopolitical risk and cyber risk, right? In terms of, there's tension in between countries, and someone may decide to launch a cyber attack or steal intellectual property. I think the other thing that drives the point home is going through some tabletop exercises and really understanding, what would happen if we had a medium-sized ransomware attack? What if it were severe? What would we do about it? What would the financial impact be? What would we need to communicate to all the stakeholders, from shareholders to regulators, et cetera? I think that begins to drive the point home to say, number one, this is something we need to pay attention to. Hopefully, more than 15 minutes a quarter, at least 16 minutes. I mean,
16,
let's walk
17.
on the wild side. Yeah, yeah. But I think the other point to drive home is that everyone's going to get into trouble, right? You can't stop cyber attacks from happening. It's kind of like, think of if a general counsel would walk into an exec committee meeting and said, I can prevent lawsuits from happening. Not exactly a realistic thing, but what you do is you put the right legal framework in place, so you minimize the legal risk. And the same thing holds true in security, right? You can't stop attacks from happening, but what you can do is do what's commercially reasonable. So when bad things happen, you have a brush fire instead of a 5-alarm fire.
So, and the context, Karen, you mentioned this. Is that a $50 million thing? Is it a $5 million risk? Is it a $50,000 risk? Because the way I'm going to think about this is going to be very different based on your answer. And then to your point, Bob, let's walk through it. If this were to happen, how bad might it be? And I think I'm going to create a graphic for this, and I need to probably just do this sooner rather than later. I think that there are two heat map grids that we're dealing with, and different people are using them differently. And my two are the one that we see the most. You've got the red is up and to the right. That's high probability, high impact. And then bottom left is green. And the goal is to drive everything from red to green, right? To drive it down and to the left. That's a compliance heat map. That's not a risk heat map. A risk heat map is actually red at the upper right and red at the bottom left. And it goes red, yellow, green, yellow, red. I'm over controlled or under controlled. And there's actually an amount that I live with every day that I'm fine with, self-insured, risk tolerance, whatever word you want to use. And my sense is that the board is thinking that style of grid. There's things that we recognize we're going to live with because the potential upside is better than the potential downside. And I think the cyber and technology conversation and audit conversation is the first kind of a graph where everything's got to go down into the green. And I think this is where that attention comes in, because many cyber people are binary. It's either perfect or it's terrible. There's nothing in between. Either it works or it's broken and all hell is going to break loose. And I think we have to live in the duality of that, I think. So now I know both of you, because we've talked about this a lot, so I'm not talking out of school, but you are big fans of that and big advocates of bringing that financial lens into cyber risk.
Yep.
And the second polling question, if you recall, was, now that we've talked with you about the vision, do you think this would be helpful? And in both the director webinar and the CISO discussion I had, it was overwhelming. 90% of the directors said, please, we need to be doing that now. 80% of the CISOs said, yes, that would make my job a whole lot easier. But less than 30% actually have started it. They've not started to go down that path. And so I started asking, what's the obstacle? What is it that is keeping you from this? And the answer that I get the most is, this is the CISO, how can I trust the numbers? And I was thinking about this, and I think I might have talked with both of you just privately about this in the past, about how do we bridge that gap? Because I think that first, how do you trust any numbers? But not trying to be cheeky about it. And I'm thinking maybe this is a vocabulary issue because there's a big difference between estimation and prediction. And when we put numbers out there, we're estimating, we're a best guess to get close. But I'm going to stop talking. What would you say, or how would you think about as you see those numbers, how you're interpreting them, and how you could maybe advise those CISOs that are worried about that, of how they can get their head around that this is actually a valuable, useful thing. I'll start with you, Bob, since I started with Karen last time.
Yeah, my instinctive reaction in terms of trusting the numbers, I think the parallels when, like, if you're using vulnerability management tools, for example, a good number of them come up with a large number of false positives. So there's a small amount of information that you really actually have to pay attention to and take action on. So, what comes to mind for me is, well, you have all this information that you're processing, and there's a lot that you can't trust, right? You have to figure out what's really meaningful. If I were back in my CISO role, I mean, I would do a trial of the balloon conversation with someone I trust, right? Start talking about the numbers and understand, does it make sense? It could be a CFO, it could be, the CFO for technology, it could be a peer, it could be my boss, but really begin to talk through the numbers and understand, is this real? I mean, I think of, especially in the environment that we're in right now, what's the short list of things that I would be doing so that I minimize the risk? And at least in my mind, two of them are protecting the data and managing identity. Because in the identity space, the bad actors want to get a hold of identities that have administrative rights or escalate to administrative rights. And if you're protecting the data properly, someone tries to steal it, there's not a whole lot you can do with it. So, but going beyond that, it's what's the proper investment that I'm going to make in protecting identity, in protecting data, doing things holistically, and then gaining consensus to say, yeah, this makes business sense to write a check for X amount. Ultimately, you're going to have a conversation with a CFO, and so the better that you can quantify risk into dollars. And going back to the question that CISOs have, do these numbers make sense? It's going to be a much easier conversation, not just with the CFO, but with the rest of the leadership team.
Yeah, I think so. That's more the ROI angle. We're going to spend this much money. We're going to spend $1 million on our identity management infrastructure because we've got $10 million or $15 million of exposure based on some quick math of just a simple data breach or a simple IP theft or something like that. You can do really quick analysis. But Karen, I was thinking about this. If I go out of technology for a second and I think about how companies do sales forecasting, and they look at the number of salespeople they have, they look at here's their annual quota. We knock that down one, maybe we take 50% of that, and that becomes our sales plan for the next year. They don't go to every salesperson and say, show me every proposal and give me a probability of each proposal closing and who is our competitor at each one. And we're going to factor in a winnability ratio for each deal. We don't do that for other parts of the business. So how would you think about this from a non-cyber person, that whole estimation versus prediction?
Yeah, I think a common theme is that executive teams and boards are more comfortable in estimation in areas that they intuitively understand. I'll give you an example. In the construction business, you could say that the number one risk in your enterprise risk framework is a full or partial building collapse. All right, so everybody can relate to that and be, oh my gosh, that would be terrible. We would be sued. I don't know what the losses were. What's our bonding? What's our insurance? Like, so, but everybody understands, like, wow, that's big. And because they understand the context of the loss, I think in certain contexts, cyber is harder to relate to in terms of what is the context of that loss. It's easy to talk about compliance, but reputation, other types of losses are just squishier, if you will. I do think it behooves everybody to understand just the basics of any model that's going to pump out a number. Like, how many other companies do you have that look like me that have contributed to this model? What is some historical losses versus what were estimated? So I think there's some basic due diligence that needs to happen. But the question I would ask above and beyond that is, we use estimates everywhere. So, in accounting estimates, so warranty based returns for sales allowances, other types of allowances, credit provisions, et cetera. So, I
Shipping
think estimates
times.
all
Yeah,
over, right?
yeah, yeah.
But it does help if the CISO can understand that you're starting from that position where boards and executive teams don't necessarily have the same context for the loss. So they can't expect the same faith, if you will, from those audiences as you would get for a different type of risk, for a credit risk or something that they're much more familiar with. And then just doing your basic due diligence on how does this work. But I think the common thread of annual loss expectancy
Yeah.
is estimatable.
Absolutely. It's really funny. Last week, I was brought in, one of the CISOs that one of our customers was presenting for the first time to their CFO and was extremely nervous. This is like the first presentation of the numbers, right? And there was the conversation of they'd gone and said, all right, here's my inherent exposure, here's my mitigated exposure, and we have insurance, and here's our residual after insurance. And the CFO looked at this. And the presentation was obviously new. I mean, anytime you saw a new report, you got to take it in, right? So this was obviously, they're seeing this for the first time. And they're like, okay, tell me again what that is. And we started walking through that. And we hadn't used the word annual loss expectancy because technical people take that very literally. That's what I expect to lose. And you say, no, this is an insurance actuarial equation, which is a probabilities times impacts. But when I said, yeah, this is the annual loss expectancy, the CFO goes, oh, got it. We're good. It was literally that fast. And the CISO was like, oh, I could have just said that. Yes.
That's too simple.
It was too simple. No, but it's a new area. This is a new skill set that I think these technical people have to learn. And then you have to be comfortable. I was looking it up. You've heard the phrase all models are wrong, but some are useful. Have you heard that
Yes.
before? I looked
Oh,
it
Yeah.
up.
yeah,
It was a
yeah.
statistician. His name was George Box. So I wanted to give the proper attribution. And I think there's an element of you have to have comfort knowing that we're not going to be perfect. And this is very counterintuitive for most CISOs because their whole upbringing is I have to be right all the time or we
Mhm,
lose everything. And
mhm.
so
Which
I
is
think this
true in
is
a
part
different,
of
right? It's true in their normal context, right?
right.
In terms of how technical
Yeah,
controls
for
work. So I
sure.
can see how that could definitely translate into a mindset of being hesitant about putting faith in an estimate. I think that's a fair point, and it's a development opportunity.
It is. And I think this is how you cross the bridge is
Right.
you have to be comfortable in your own skin on that. We've always said from our side, from the X Analytics side, our goal is not perfection because perfection is unattainable. Our goal is to be directionally correct, shapes, sizes, and directions. It's about 50 million. It's about 70 million. It's about 5 million. Because are you really going to make a different decision if it's 5 million or 5,132,014 cents?
Hmm.
No, it's a $5 million risk. That's what and so if you're asking me to spend, if you ask me to spend 5 million on a $5 million risk, I'm going to say no. If you ask me to spend a million on a $5 million risk, now we're in the maybe zone. If it's
Hmm.
500K to save a $5 million risk, you're probably a good chance of getting a yes. And then conversely, don't ask me to spend 10 million on a $5 million risk. It doesn't make sense. So directionally correct. Any other advice to CISOs on how to get comfortable with that bit of uncertainty, Bob?
Yeah, building on what you're saying, as a CISO, you know you're going to have a problem at some point, but you don't know exactly when. So for example, I know, for example, that on May 26th, I'm going to have a cyber attack, right? That's just,
We're going to
it's
write
not,
that down.
well, there you go. And unless you have strong clairvoyant skills, that's probably not something good to communicate. But what you could
Wasn't
say,
that a Dilbert comic? The boss came in
if
and said, I need
knowledge,
to know every day that we're going to have a cyber attack.
well, if it wasn't a Dilbert cartoon, it should have been. But I think going back to having the conversation with the leadership team and board to say, we're properly prepared for bad things to happen, right? And you know, we think that it's reasonable to spend this amount, and if we do, then it's going to cost us X, but here's the value that we get out of it. I think that's the right thing. And going back to what you were saying earlier in terms of the CISO getting in front of the CFO for the first time, if you're not comfortable in finance as a CISO, go
Mm.
study it, learn, spend time with your CFO, because that's the language that's going to make you successful over time.
Very cool. Karen, any other words of wisdom as we get ready to land the plane here?
No, I agree with Bob in terms of brush up on your financial acumen and go talk to members individually on the executive leadership team. I think what I have found is most are very interested in cyber and they actually are very supportive of doing what needs to be done and try out some things like test out a few formats, build your skills with a few friendlies in terms of how to have that discussion. And you're never going to get 100%, right? You're never going to get 100% of the leadership team or the board 100% behind you with, we've got to go. And that's okay. I think that's rare in most topics.
Very
Just,
cool.
go with critical mass and keep trying and developing yourself and the ability to do that.
Perfect. Good. I think that's a great wrap up spot. I'd like to thank both of you for being here for this extended conversation. And my sense is that we could probably keep talking for another 2 hours or 3 hours because it is a pretty cool topic. But I think we'll end it here. Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure to have both of you here. And I'm sure we'll individually keep having more of this conversation over the days to come. For the podcast audience, keep an eye out for future episodes. We're going to keep digging deeper and exploring the cutting edge of thinking around cyber risk and cyber governance. And until then, bye-bye.